Okay, so it's 1:30 now and we are going to get started. This panel is dedicated to relevance and metaphor, and our first speaker today is Mengyang Qiu, who will be talking about communicating conceptual and perceptual dimensions, mental imagery in the dual route processing of metaphor. So Mengyang Qiu, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Erica. I'll just quickly share my. Can everybody see my slides? Hopefully that will work. Okay, hello, thank you for coming to my presentation. My name is Mengyang. I'm currently doing my PhD in University of Brighton. In the following 20 minutes, I'll be talking about the possible role mental imagery play in our experience of metaphor. I will start by very briefly addressing mental imagery, what it is and how it works. And then I will introduce also very briefly how relevant theory addresses metaphor. And then I will propose this, what I call the dual road processing in metaphor experience. And then I'll conclude my presentation with a brief summary. So let's first start with this poem. It has been found again, what eternity? It's the sea mingled with the sun. As you read these few lines, you might be having a mental image, but you probably won't be seeing lots of details. The point is we have a genuine experience of seeing or feeling something when we read a poetic metaphor. Here's what I'm interested in. Can we integrate mental imagery into a pragmatic theory? To explore this issue, let's first have a look at mental imagery. So the thing about mental imagery is that many people experience it, but nobody is 100% sure how it works. Here's one definition. Mental imageries are representations and the accompanying experience of sensory informations without a direct external stimulus. Such representations are recalled from memory and lead one to re-experience a version of the original stimulus or some novel combination of stimuli. So based on this definition, we may highlight a few points. First of all, a mental image does not represent in the same way as pictures does. We don't have pictures in our head. And although we usually talk about visual ones, we can have mental images associated with other sensory modules. Second of all, mental imagery doesn't require direct stimulation, but it nonetheless involves early cortical perceptual processing. And third, mental imagery may be voluntary or involuntary. Unwanted intrusive imagery, earworms, fever dreams are just a couple of examples of the involuntary ones. And last but not least, and this might be a bit controversial, mental imagery may be conscious or unconscious, since perception, which is perceptual processing with direct stimuli, may be unconscious. Mental imagery, arguably, which is perceptual processing without direct stimuli, may also be unconscious. Several studies on binocular rivalry tests and implicit biases have provided some evidence. Then how does it work? Some researchers believe that mental imagery consists of a perceptual surface representation and the conceptual deep representation associated with it. The deep representation is not directly available to consciousness. So if we think of our mind as a computer, then the surface representation would be the image shown on the screen, and the deep representation would be the raw data of the file. We cannot read the raw data directly. It needs to be translated into some kind of viewable formats. We interpret what the image is about, but the image itself shares a common format with percept. McGinn provides a more recent account that mental imagery is just a different kind of seeing. We see with our eyes, but we experience via our brain. To have a mental image is to voluntarily construct a visual representation of an object. Seeing with the mind's eye is active, whereas perception is passive. We cannot choose if or what we see if the object is placed directly in front of us, but we can choose and manipulate the image we have in our mind. So here we have a dichotomy between perception and imagining, which is in Mengyang's framework, the equivalent of having a mental image. And according to relevant theory, mental imagery is considered as a genuine experience in metaphor reading, but it is a byproduct of inference, and I'll explain what that means very briefly. So relevant theory regards metaphor as processed in fundamentally the same way as other linguistic expressions. It communicates assumptions both explicitly and implicitly, therefore it can be seen as a kind of loose use. Metaphor achieves optimal relevance by making manifest one or two very strong implicatures, or by making manifest a wider range of weak but equally plausible implicatures. Then what does the speaker communicate explicitly? Like in other cases of language use, metaphor requires a lexical-pragmatic process where content word give access to a conceptual file, which is then contextually adjusted and fine-tuned. So this is known as an ad hoc concept, one that is not stored in memory, but rather constructed on the fly with more or less specific denotation of a mental state. So it should be considered as part of the explicature. So for example, in this sentence, John's state is a block of ice. So the speaker explicitly communicates an ad hoc concept, a block of ice, and via a lexical pragmatic process, this sentence will allow access to assumptions such as John's state is cold, also an ad hoc concept, which will further allow John's state is unapproachable. And then we take that as a plausible metaphorical reading of the original sentence. So a more radical account further suggests that instead of creating an ad hoc concept, the hearer is perhaps creating an occasion-specific mental file that contains relevant information about the context. And this file further provides basis for further inference. So in either way, we may have an image of John's state in the original sentence, and this image is likely the result of sensory modules being activated by the linguistic encoded content. That is to say, mental imagery is salient, but it's a byproduct. It does not necessarily fall within the scope of pragmatics. But our search for relevance doesn't stop once we've had positive cognitive effects. The metaphor doesn't just make me see or feel something. The fact that I have such kind of non-propositional experience will in return influence how I process certain information. I suggest that mental imagery may provide cues to ostension by pointing to constituents from memory and perhaps our bodily experience that perceptually resembles the sensory input. The construction of imagery further activates a range of representation of different degrees of relevance, and attending to them will allow me to better gauge the overall relevance of the utterance. So for example, in this poem, green beauty, tranquil and at leisure, red garments, light then dark again, the flower's heart grieves, about to break, from spring colors, how can the heart be known? So this metaphor certainly communicates certain speaker's meaning. However, I argue that the poet also self-expresses his perception and introspection about a certain event. At the same time, the poet also intends me to, as a reader, to experience similar mental states and then to attribute this experience to his intentions. This is done by inviting me to imagine the scene as is described, so that I may construct an image, and then the image will give access to associated mental representations or mental states. So I'm particularly interested in the third line here because it shows, well, in my opinion, it shows two types of processing. So first of all, we will have a conceptual route in which the explicature would be the grieving heart of the flower is about to break. And this explicature will give access to several contextual assumptions, such as the flower with a grieving heart is sad, one is sad when bad things happened, and withering is a bad thing for the flower. And together, I may come to a contextual conclusion: the flower with a grieving heart is about to wither. And at the same time, there may be a perceptual route in which I would probably construct mental images such as a red flower with green leaves and the flower is withering. And together, those mental images points to act as points of connection by, for example, giving a feeling of melancholy when imagining the contrast between those two images, or perhaps by inviting an imaginative experience of me being in similar situations, or perhaps by giving access to, giving rise to the feeling of loss about not having enough time. And then the two routes combined, I may retrieve the intended contents that on the one hand is the speaker's meaning. For example, beautiful things do not last. I will get old before I make great achievements, but at the same time, some non-propositional effects on the reader. So mental images, a shared impression, a particular emotional state, sympathy, apathy, empathy, etc. So in this case, imagery prompts an intuitive but also relevant experience, possibly at a lower cost, which creates connecting points to the speaker's meaning and then contributes to a full appreciation of the intended content. The selected representations are more relevant, either because they are more frequently established, therefore more readily accessible, or perhaps they mainly require lower level perceptual processing. So what are the benefits of this dual route processing? First of all, the speaker or the writer does not always communicate a precise meaning. She is perhaps more likely to bring into the reader's attention how a situation is to be experienced, and what kind of feelings or affections are to be raised. Second of all, mental imagery leads to an intuitive quasi-perceptual processing. It functions as a rich bundle of stimuli that modifies the reader's perceptual systems, making him more likely to attend to the stimuli or certain aspects of the stimuli, forming an iterative processing loop. And these effects are carefully and purposefully designed, crafted, and manipulated by the writer, so the reader can experience them in the way the writer intends them to. So of course, individual readers will have their own interpretations which deviate from what is intended, but that's almost entirely their own experience. So it should not be confused with speaker's intention. Is it possible to integrate the perceptual and conceptual dimensions? There are some empirical data showing that certain areas in the right hemisphere, which are associated with perceptual processing, are involved in reading figurative language or the more literal use. I'm not going into explaining what's the problem with the literal use here. The question is whether and to what extent imagery can influence the pragmatic processing of metaphor. Of course, the speaker does not communicate a single concrete image, but she kind of points to constituents from experience that perceptually resembles the sensory input and thus provide cues to ostension. Imagery guides the reader's attention to focus on specific aspects of the utterance. In her work, Colletti suggests that some human actions are perceptually driven, and such a pursuit can often extend into conceptual world. We like and prefers to eat tasty food, and we spend hours talking about them. In this case, tasty food achieves optimal relevance, not based on cognitive effects, but in her words, perceptual effects, which are modifications on the perceptual and sensory motor systems. Artwork or art stimuli work in the same way. our response to the artwork is directly towards an introspective state about how the artwork is meta-represented. So the artwork will convey both the information about an aesthetic response and at the same time the response itself. So for my argument, I suggest that the imagery we have is kind of like a meta-representation of the type of perceptual experience possibly derived from the writer. By entertaining an image, we not only have an automatic perceptual response to the stimulus, but can also simulate what it feels like for the writer to have a perceptual experience in the first place. And then we can attribute this simulation to what is intended by the writer. To further reconcile the conceptual and perceptual representations involved in mental activities, Lawrence Basselou proposed the perceptual symbol system, suggesting that cognition is inherently perceptual. So his basic idea is that a perceptual experience will be parsed, selected, and represented as perceptual symbols, which in his words are records of neural states. And those symbols can be later systematically reactivated in response to different situations. These perceptual symbols also operate on introspection, including representational states, cognitive operations, and emotional states. So they can be focused on a certain aspect of the experience. According to Basselou's framework, these symbols support the construction of not only mental imagery, but our entire conceptual structure. Changes of context will lead to the change of activation pattern, so then we can run different simulations in the absence of the events they represent, much in the same way as how we construct a mental image. These simulations are always partial and they are subject to bias, but they can also be flexible and productive. How an event is perceived will be integrated into schematic, perceptual, and introspective states, which will automatically activate coherent inferences. So we can perhaps see mental imagery as a case of simulation, where stored perceptual symbols are systematically reactivated to support conceptualization, categorization, and further reasoning. Let me briefly illustrate with this poem. In a long boat, rain cloak and a hat of reeds, an old man's fishing the cold river snow. So following the relevant theoretical module, I can draw a certain contextual conclusion, but that doesn't necessarily tell me how I'm supposed to feel about this description. The poet is also interested in communicating a certain kind of feeling that arises when an image is entertained. So now suppose I have this image, fishing in the cold river snow. It perceptually resembles the sensory input from what it represents, because the construction of this image relies on retrieving perceptual constituents from memory. The image then further activates representation in my memory, such as fishing, snow, fishing in snow, etc., as well as my perceptual and introspective memories of what it feels like to be in the snow. I will only attend to some of the representations, and those attended to will guide me through my search for conceptually relevant content. At the same time, they also direct my attention to what the poet intends me to feel, which is perceptually or affectively relevant in this situation. So in this case, the original mental image act as a springboard for a more comprehensive overall experience. Note that I'm not suggesting that comprehension is the same thing as interpretation is not the same thing, nor am I implying that the poet communicates a single image. I attribute what I feel to the poet's intention because he's the one who provides all those cues that constrain my construction of my mental imagery. Finally, a quick summary of the take-home message of my presentation. I suggest that mental imagery plays a more active role in verbal communication, as has been recognized, especially in cases such as a poetic metaphor, where achieving non-propositional effects can be as important as, or perhaps even more important than, achieving cognitive effects. And mental imagery serves the purpose of pointing to constituents from experience that allow access to further representations. Attending to them will shift my focus to certain aspects of a stimulus, giving rise to both positive cognitive and positive perceptual effects to gauge the overall relevance. The image is intended as such, so it should fall within the domain of pragmatics. So in this way, a poetic metaphor is supposed to be both understood and felt. Thank you for your attention. I'll be glad to receive comments and feedbacks.
Thank you very much for such a very interesting talk on mental imagery. So the floor is all yours now to ask any questions that you may have or provide some feedback or comments. You can leave them on the chat or you can raise your hands and unmute yourselves. Oh, Christoph, sorry, I didn't see you there. Go ahead.
Hi. Well, thank you for this very interesting talk. My question is, you were saying on the one hand, mental images, they're not necessarily pictures in the mind. So that means they could be represented as kind of a set of assumptions. And so my question is, I follow you in basically everything you were saying, but my question is, in which sense is that kind of metaphor processing can be said to be a dual root? Because the processing of images or emotions or other non-representational non-representational things could be accounted for as basically making manifest a huge set of assumptions, set of weak implicatures. And certainly with the emotional effects like of surprise, it's we can actually go quite a long way in explaining this without leaving the traditional relevance theory route. And so that's basically my question. Why should this evidence be understood as dual route in processing instead of what relevance theory has said so far about non-propositional effects?
Okay, thank you for the question. There are actually quite a lot of things involved in the question you just raised, so I've tried to be brief. So first of all, the thing with mental imagery is that there is this decades-long debate about the nature and the mechanism of mental imagery, which I don't really have time to go into details. But the examples that I used, Kosling's idea is basically mental image is kind of like an analog. It's analogous to what we received from our perceptual input system. So in that case, mental imagery is not propositional. It shares a same format, or if not exactly the same, a common format with perception. Whereas on the other hand, there are other researchers suggest that mental imagery, the nature of mental imagery is they're basically sentence-like structures. So this is the propositional approach to mental imagery, which argues that if you have a mental imagery, you're basically forming a sentence-like structure in your mind, which associate whatever thing you perceived with the conceptual content in your mind. So I don't really have a definite answer about what mental imagery is, because this is still an ongoing debate. And the proposal I'm making in my presentation about this dual road processing is not an entirely new thing. The idea of dual road processing has been studied in psychology, in neurosciences for quite a long while. And people are arguing that this is a very common thing in our processing of basically everything. You can have a faster, more intuitive, spontaneous processing when it comes to something like perception, emotions, etc. But then you can also have a slower route, which will be more fine-tuned when you are when we are processing something like conceptual content. I'm not suggesting that we are using this dual road processing to replace what relevant theory has already provided us, because I think that's a very neat account for how metaphor works. What I'm suggesting is that on top of that, so relevant theory has already provided a very neat account of how we come to a metaphorical conclusion. But this is just the propositional aspects of metaphor experience. We can also, on top of that, we can also have a perceptual experience, which will include mental imagery, emotions, impressions, feelings, etc. So in my understanding, in my proposal, I'm saying that we can perhaps include those perceptual dimensions of metaphor processing into pragmatic theory. So we're not only having cognitive effects when we're reading a metaphor, which is fundamentally propositional. We can also have some non-propositional effects, and those non-propositional effects might be the result of the perceptual route in the dual road processing. And together, we can have a more comprehensive experience when it comes to metaphor reading. So I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you, Qiu. We might have time for another quick question. Robin. Robin, I don't think we can hear you. I might be the only one. Can you hear Robin? No, okay. Robin, yeah, I don't think we can hear you, even though you're unmuted. No. Something with the microphone, maybe from on your computer.
Perhaps we can try mute and then unmute again.
Yeah, I'll try that. You're right. No, we can't hear you at all. No. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. We can ask the question later on. Okay. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Okay, so thank you very much, Qiu, for such an interesting talk. Again, I really enjoyed that. So we are